It's time to get nerdy, y'all.
A little bit of gaming history for you.
Something relevant in gaming and discuss our opinions on it.
Should we kick it out of here, or should we kick-start it?
This is the part where you, the listeners, try to stump the hosts.
I'm not a lawyer. I just play one on a podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, lads and lasses of all ages, welcome to a slightly different show tonight. Because like Mr. Nice Guy mentioned last week, he's off on a trip right now and can't make the show. But he will be back at the usual time next week. And the show just isn't quite the same without him. Not least reason because without Mr. Nice Guy to hold me back, I can get a touch ranty. So fair warning here. But there has been some big news this week that if nothing else, I think is just worth highlighting. Because has it felt to anybody else like the industry just picked the same few weeks to kind of go crazy? I mean, just a few examples to cite here. So first off, Escape from Tarkov, right? That's an FPS game that's been in various stages of alpha access and closed beta access since 2016. Although, is it really closed access if all you have to do is just buy it? By that same standard, any game that you don't pirate is closed access. But I digress. They call it closed beta. And as of today, you can buy in to that closed beta for $50, $82, $110, and even $250, with varying levels of safe equipment stashes and exclusive resources and equipment for your character. But $250 was only recently the top price. Previously, it was their $150 Edge of Darkness edition. Now that was available with an express promise for all future downloadable content available for free at that level of support for the game. At the end of April, after having ended the previously available $150 Edge of Darkness edition, they announced the new $250 edition called the Unheard Of edition. And this isn't all that surprising. These sorts of things happen, different editions available. But the thing that seemed crazy was that the new software changes that were going to come to the game, namely some exclusive equipment and an offline game mode, weren't going to be considered downloadable content. Instead, these were new features of content that was going to be downloadable, but they would not be available to the people who had previously paid $150 with the understanding of all future downloadable content. Now, after a few days of pushback from the community, they placated people with some promises of a discounted upgrade price. So for those who had already put down $150 for this title, in the future, they would be able to pay less than that extra $100 to get to that new edition, and eventual access to some of those new software features for those who didn't buy the top tier, available sometime in the future this year when it's ready to release, whatever that means. But I think we have an understanding of what release schedules tend to look like. The second one was about Helldivers 2. So, in February, Helldivers 2 was released, and at the beginning of the month of May, was the fastest-selling game of all time for PlayStation publishing. And it was doing better player numbers than Call of Duty and Fortnite, titans in the industry. And then Sony Publishing mandated that to continue playing Helldivers 2, everyone would need to make a PlayStation Network account. Now, as mentioned in episode 305, there is a large chunk of countries in the world where you are straight up not allowed to make a PlayStation Network account. A detail that I feel like the people at Sony must have known. Yet they felt it was worth it anyway to just take the money from those PC purchasers who can't make an account with them because of where they just so happen to live. And while Valve was kind enough to make their own refunds on some of the purchases, there really isn't any evidence to suggest that Sony will ever pay that money back or pay money to those people who potentially were going to be left out in the cold. But they did say that they were going to make it right. And the way that they've done that is that so far they have not made that requirement for Helldivers 2. But they have announced that it will be a requirement for the next game that's getting a PC release, Ghosts of Tsushima. And just for good measure, to make sure that this never happens to anybody again, they're just not going to allow it for sale in regions without PlayStation Network access. So I guess that's one way to keep anybody from falling through the cracks. The third one comes to us courtesy of Microsoft. So near the end of last year, Microsoft had purchased Activision Blizzard and all of its subsidiary developers, of course, for a hefty chunk of change. And in the early days of this month announced that they were closing 4 of those studios, including Tango Gameworks, the makers of Hi-Fi Rush, a rhythm action game that won a BAFTA last year. You would be forgiven for not realizing that video games won BAFTAs, but they totally do. Microsoft said they needed to close these studios in order to reprioritize the titles and resources, which means that a few teams will need to be realigned to others, and some of our colleagues will be leaving us. Now, never mind that we have no evidence to suggest that actual developers were moved to different teams, just that everybody found out that their studio was going up. And fourthly, and most recently, just a couple of days after we recorded our last episode, EA Games announced a very thoughtful development for their AAA titles. In the industry, AAA titles are usually defined as video games developed with a very large budget, a very large development team, and usually the team is also directly managed by the publisher itself. Games like Final Fantasy, The Last of Us, Mass Effect, Grand Theft Auto. These games are AAA titles, and they tend to start at $70 for the base game. These are the games with the highest price tags in the industry. EA Games had a corporate earnings call, and that's where they talk to shareholders and tell them what's going on at the company. Usually there's a question and answer segment afterward, and that is when a representative from Goldman Sachs, notable lovers of art over there at Goldman Sachs, they asked about what EA Games was doing about putting ads into their video games in order to improve profits. And the CEO, Andrew Wilson, said, quote, "We have teams internally in the company right now looking at how to do thoughtful implementations of ads inside of our games." End quote. Now, the last time EA dabbled with this, they ran full-screen ads for the Amazon show The Boys in the game UFC 4. Everyone hated that, but I'm sure they're doing better. See, now, ads in games is a somewhat common thing in a free mobile game, but it's worth asking if that's what you wanted in any of your games, much less the $70 game. Apologies for the prolonged rant, my fellow nerds, but doesn't it just feel like the response you get when you express dissatisfaction at things that are universally disliked, and that things that none of us asked for, it seems to get met with derision from anyone trying to ask the company to do right by us as customers. But it's not all bad news. For example, we have some encouraging news from the Stop Killing Games efforts in the UK that I can't wait to talk about with Lam on the next episode. There are still things that we can do and ways that we can improve the industry that produces the art we so love. But we will be saving that for a proper full episode treatment next week. So until then, be excellent to each other and keep it nerdy, everyone.